You are listening to Arta Iranian Cultural Center. There are many ways to control a nation. Some governments build prisons, some build armies, some build intelligence agencies, surveillance systems, hidden files, and invisible walls. Some control borders, some control money, some control information. But the most powerful prison is often the one a human being is taught to carry inside. A prison with no steel bars, no locked gates, no armed guards, and yet it can silence millions. Its name is fear. Tonight, we're not telling the story of a government or a political slogan or headlines that appear one day and disappear the next. Tonight, we're telling the story of something deeper, something quieter, something far more dangerous. We are telling the story of imposition. What happens when power no longer asks, but commands? When it no longer persuades, but defines? When it no longer governs from a distance, but enters homes, schools, bodies, screens, memories, and even the private conversations people have with themselves. This is the story of 48 years of imposed obedience in Iran. And this is the story of what survives beneath it.
The final stage of control is not when a state tells people what to do. The final stage is when it tells people what reality is.
For millions of women and girls, control began with the body. Hair became political, clothing became political, walking, standing, and even looking became political. A strand of hair could become evidence. A photograph could become a warning. A public smile could spark a conversation that became an interrogation, and an interrogation could become a permanent record. For nearly 5 decades, what women wear in public has not been treated as personal. It has been treated as political.
Within the first years after the revolution, dress regulations were formalized. By the early 1980s, mandatory veiling laws were enforced across all public institutions. Enforcement was not passive. It was systematic. Warning became fines, fines became detentions, detentions became records, and records became leverage. International reporting by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations documented decades of compulsory dress enforcement, public harassment, arrests, and physical intimidation. In recent years, authorities expanded that enforcement through surveillance technology. Cameras, license plate recognition, mobile reporting systems, and digital tools. What once required an officer on the street now sometimes requires only a lens.
My mother taught me how to fix my scarf before she taught me how to sign my name. My grandmother taught me which buses to avoid. My sister taught me how to smile without attracting attention. None of them called it fear. They called it normal. And when something becomes normal, you stop asking when it began.
And then, in September of 2022, the world learned a name, Mahsa Amini, a young woman, 22 years old, detained by the morality police. Days later, she was dead in custody. The official explanation was a heart attack. The evidence told a different story. What followed was not just a protest. It was a rupture, a sentence spoken by millions across every city in Iran and by Iranians on every continent. 3 words that had lived in whispers for decades finally reached the open air. Woman, life, freedom. For a brief moment, the world looked. And for a brief moment, fear looked back. But control did not stop at the body. It entered the classroom, the textbook, the library, the lecture hall, the student dormitory, and the exam paper. It entered language itself. And once language is controlled, thought is never far behind.
In 1980, universities across Iran were shut down in what became known as the Cultural Revolution. Thousands of students, professors, and academics were removed. Curriculums were rewritten. Political vetting expanded. Academic loyalty became as important as academic excellence, sometimes even more so. Across the decades that followed, student movements repeatedly became targets of surveillance, arrest, suspension, and disciplinary pressure. Independent thought was not always criminal, but it was consistently monitored. And the line between the two was never entirely clear to those standing near it.
At school, we memorized speeches before we understood their meaning. We repeated slogans before we understood politics. We learned how to answer correctly before we learned how to ask freely. And some questions you only asked when the classroom was empty.
Children do not always inherit ideology. Sometimes they inherit silence. Sometimes they inherit caution, the ability to read a room before speaking. And sometimes that survival skill simply becomes adulthood.
A nation speaks through its poets, musicians, actors, journalists, comedians, filmmakers, and the children who tell the stories. But what happens when every voice must first pass inspection? When creativity requires permission, music requires approval, a book requires clearance, and a film must be edited before it's even born?
For decades, independent journalists faced suspension, interrogation, arrest, and prosecution. Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists have repeatedly ranked Iran among the most restrictive media environments in the world. Editors were questioned, writers were warned, filmmakers were censored, musicians were denied performance permits. Entire productions were rewritten before the public ever saw them. Iranian cinema paradoxically produced some of the most celebrated films in world history because its artists became masters of metaphor. When direct language was forbidden, they found other languages. Poetry became resistance. Allegory became a weapon. Truth did not always disappear, but often it had to change its clothes.
Silence does not always sound like silence. Sometimes it sounds like a song never released, a book never printed, a film never shown, a joke never finished, a question never asked. The Persian literary tradition, one of the oldest and most sophisticated in the world, survived precisely because artists learned to carry meaning in forms the censor could not easily touch. A ghazal about wine was not never only about wine. A poem about a nightingale was never only about birds. Culture found corridors where ideology could not follow.
In every generation, power learns a new language. In the 20th century, it was newspapers, radio, television, and printed books. But in the 21st century, power found something far more dangerous: connection. A message sent in seconds, a video uploaded in minutes, a photograph shared across continents, a live stream, a voice note, a witness, a memory that could no longer be erased simply by confiscating a camera. For governments built on controlling narratives, the internet became something more than technology. It became a threat.
Over the past 2 decades, Iran developed one of the most sophisticated systems of internet filtering in the region. Thousands of websites were blocked. Social media platforms were restricted. Messaging applications were interrupted. VPNs were criminalized. Search results were filtered. Online activity became increasingly visible to the state. Freedom House, NetBlocks, and Amnesty International repeatedly documented digital restrictions, surveillance systems, and intentional nationwide disruptions. During nationwide protests in 2019, the internet disappeared. Almost entirely. For days, families could not call each other. Journalists could not upload footage. Messages stopped arriving, and while millions were digitally isolated, reports of deadly crackdowns continued to emerge. Then, again in 2022 and again in 2026, but this time, something changed. This time it did not last days or weeks. It lasted months. International reporting described what analysts called the longest sustained internet blackout in modern Iranian history. More than 60 consecutive days, affecting tens of millions of people. Businesses paralyzed, teachers disconnected, doctors unable to communicate with patients, online workers losing their income, and they still stay disconnected.
Every morning I open my phone, not to read the news, not to answer messages, not to check my work. I opened it to see if reality had returned. And every morning, the screen looked back at me empty.
But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was not that the internet disappeared. It was that for some people, it never did. While millions remained disconnected, some remained fully online. Officials, approved companies, selected institutions, privileged users.
Multiple international investigations described systems of selective connectivity, special access networks, approved digital permissions, state-linked communications, white SIM cards, and so-called Internet Pro packages reserved for vetted accounts. Domestic intranet access remained available for those with the right clearance. Filtered gateways kept the approved class connected to the world while the rest of the country was cut off from it. Connectivity itself became tiered, and for the first time in a way that was nakedly visible, truth became a privilege.
When food becomes scarce, we call it inequality. When justice becomes selective, we call it corruption. But when truth becomes selective, the access to reality is distributed based on loyalty. What do we call that? Perhaps we call it the architecture of silence.
My cousin worked for a government office. He could still send files, open websites, talk to clients overseas. I could not send one message to my own sister. That was the day I realized they were not just controlling information. They were dividing reality. This tiered system where the powerful stayed connected and the powerless went dark was not an accident of infrastructure. It was a deliberate design. Silence for the many, bandwidth for the few. Control dressed as technical limitation.
Power is strongest when fear speaks with legal language, when a sentence becomes a warning, when a courtroom becomes theater, when a judge becomes a message, when a confession arrives before the trial.
Over the decades, students, journalists, lawyers, workers, teachers, artists, writers, activists, and ordinary citizens appeared before revolutionary courts. The United Nations, Human Rights Watch, and other legal observers documented allegations of solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, restricted legal access, closed hearings, coerced statements, forced confessions, and trials lasting only minutes. Some defendants reportedly met their lawyers for the first time inside the courtroom. Others never saw one at all. Televised confessions extracted under duress and broadcasted to the nation served as justice but as performance. The courtroom was not merely a legal space, it was a communications strategy.
My brother came home quieter. He never told us what happened, never described the room, never described the questions. He didn't need to. We heard it every time he stopped talking.
Some prisons are built from concrete, others are built from memory, and some people never fully leave either one.
نفر از دور داره میخونه آسمون وحشت ما سفره تاره شرم از این کابوس شرم از این افسوس شرم از این رنج بیهوده پرده تلی از خاکستر از گلوی تو صدای ما بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو 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 میپریم از خواب یه شب مهتاب یکی میگه آیادم ها یا همه با هم یا همه تنها ما که بیداریم تا فردا گلوی تو تا صدای ما بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو 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 یا همه با هم یا همه تنها روز نو یا شب بی فردا میپریم از خواب یه شب مهتاب یکی میگه آیادم ها خاک این گندم خیابونه خوشه خشم من و تو تشنه بارونه حق ما کم نیست زانوی غم نیست قلب ما که دور از هم نیست دنیای تازه این یه آغازه پنجره تا رویا بازه یا همه با هم یا همه تنها و بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو 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 میپریم از خواب یه شب مهتاب ما که